And talking about migration, which is of course the movement of people from one country to the next, we have two classifications: immigration or in-migration, out-migration or immigration. And in terms of immigration, as all of you know, immigration is when, for example, people leave Iran to come to live in Canada, and the reverse of it, leave in Canada to go to live, for example, in Australia, would be out-migration. And the differences in terms of how many people do either types of migration is important in population studies. The difference between the number of people who immigrate versus people who out-migrate is called the migration rate, which is important because it's another measure that helps us to keep track of changes in patterns of population flows, as well as in terms of keeping track of population size and predictions. And what is important in terms of defining what migration is that at least in theory, migration refers to the process where people move from one country to another voluntarily. They might be leaving their country, out of need for work, or if they decide to join their family or something like that. There's usually definitely a reason for it, but it is thought of as, again, theoretically, it's thought of as an act that is voluntary and is a result of a decision-making process where the people or the person who's migrating has gone through a process of thinking and cost and benefit analysis and has decided that they want to move. So that's that's where it's thought, and this is important when and I will explain why this. Remember, this distinction about migration is important in the next slide. And we have two types of migration: domestic and international. Which, of course, with respect to domestic, it would be migrating from one province to another, and internationally would be across countries, of course. And there's another term in terms of migration, which is associated with domestic migration, which is called secondary migration, and it's the movement of newcomers from their original arrival destination to another province or city within the same country. So, for example, if a migrant family who has immigrated to Canada first enters one province, then decides to go to another province within usually the first year, it could be even like the first first year-ish, but it's usually done even like either shortly after or within the first year. So, for example, when I first came to Canada with my family, we immigrated as permanent residents, and we landed in Toronto. But then after we lived there for a while, we decided that was not the city for us, and we moved here. And usually the reasons for secondary migration is either in Canada specifically is either because of harsh weather, or most prominently noted in literature is that people tend to migrate because they want to join existing communities, racial communities and ethnic communities. Because in some of the cities, for example, if people are migrating to provinces that are not very much populated or diverse with newcomers, they tend to do this so that they can come to cities where there's like an ethnic community, existing, and they have people, or they might be joining their family members, or because of finding jobs. And again, for us, it was because I had family in Vancouver, and we decided to not live in isolation in Toronto and come here. So this process is also important with relation to domestic migration, and it's called secondary migration. It can also happen with respect to like prices of housing and life, like living expenses as well. So like some like some migrant families might be moving because to move to a place that is more affordable. So it could be economical, but usually most often noted is that they move because they want to join family or exist in ethnic communities. It is noteworthy here to just think about how immigration is classified in Canada. We have different classifications of immigrants. With respect to permanent residents, the main class of immigrants in Canada come through economic class, which is a class that considers economic factors in terms of how either that person has the skills and potential to join the economic labor market, or also it could be in terms of their assets and so on, but it's more so in terms of joining the labor market. Being able to integrate into the labor market is the most determining factor. The family class would be like people who are sponsored through their family members. There are refugees who, once they enter, they have permanent residency, and there are government-assisted refugees, sponsored refugees, and a blended visa refugees. Government-assisted refugees would be refugees that so the way that Canada accepts refugees comes through UN's selection, and one of the main criteria is vulnerability and need that is assessed by UN. So what happens is that refugees who are interested in coming to Canada as refugees usually register through UN, and they go through a selection process, and then they're introduced to Canadian government, and that would be government-assisted refugees. So these are refugees that the government accepts to host. The latest examples would be the Afghani refugees that are coming in. The Syrian refugees would fall within the same. There's also sponsored refugees, which is also in a similar manner. However, it can also be people or institution entities. A lot of churches in Canada actually sponsor refugees, so this happened a lot with Syrian refugees when they entered Canada. And blended visa is a combination of the two above. And there are other types of classes but they don't happen a lot. So humanitarian and compassionate cases are comparing to other groups are pretty much rare. Canada doesn't accept people who try to enter Canada via the border, like ground border or water border. Like the number of people who pass through, people who show up at the border and claim want to are interested in becoming refugees in Canada and enter the country as refugees that are by the border. It happens really rarely, like in comparison to other groups. Usually Canada only accepts refugees through the selection process from UN and the above, or a sponsorship or blended visa. So they have to have been granted the status before coming here. And there are also temporary residents, temporary foreign worker programs, international students, of course, and visitors. We already talked about how immigration to Canada was instrumental to the development of Canada a little bit, and how when we were talking about the aging population, we talked about how it is instrumental in the sense that keeping increasing the population that is active in the labor force, and how that is important to Canada's economic future. And so again, the immigration approach that Canada has is pragmatic in the sense that they're interested in newcomers who can join the labor market, and it has always been that way. It has been Canada's immigration policy is selective in that way, and it is also selective even when it comes to refugees in a lot of the cases. There's a focus on accepting newcomers who can be potential human capital in Canada, in the sense that they can be active in the Canadian labor market. And just to give you a sense of how many, with regards especially to the refugee classes, how many, what is the sort of the comparison between them? Usually the private-sponsored refugees has the highest number, followed by government-assisted refugees, and then blended visa. This is a projection that was made in 2018, but the differences between the different classes of refugees remains relatively accurate. And this is an infographic by UNHCR, and they're even announcing here that only 8% of refugees that are identified for resettlement by UNHCR will receive resettlement. So resettlement meaning here that they're accepted to become refugees in a host country to receive services in the sense that they're accepted, for example, to come to Canada as refugees. And this is also another graph that shows the differences between the classes that those who came under the selection process and those who came under private sponsorship. You can see that they differ drastically. And again, just to give you a sense of the immigration level plans in Canada, you don't have to memorize these numbers. This is from a policy brief from the Royal Society of Canada, which they published this report pretty recent. So what happened was that Canada had a target level for permanent resident admission to Canada that was disrupted once the COVID-19 happened. So literally when they announced it right after, very soon after, maybe like 2-3 weeks after the lockdowns and travel bans came in. So like the 46% shortfall is due to that. And like the new, well, we're not, like post-COVID, like we're still in the COVID era, but the targets for projections are all above 400,000 each year. So that's the plan that Canada has to, for example, for this year, it's 401,000 permanent residents and slightly increases in the upcoming years, but it's it's quite higher than previous targets previous to 2021 because they're trying to make up for the 46% shortfall that happened due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what happened was that one of the strategies that came up with, which I haven't specified here because it was like a unique program, but you can chat if you like to about it, was that they came up with a special program for people who had short temporary residency here in Canada so that they could receive permanent residency. And this was if you're an international student, you probably have heard about it because it happened a few months ago. And the cap for international students to apply for permanent residency through that specific nomination program was about, I think, less than 50,000, which was met in 24 hours. So they've been strategizing to come up with ways to make up for that shortfall, and there are plans for increasing immigration levels specifically with permanent residents because the majority, the majority comes with classes is pretty ambitious. And I'm going to share with you a few slides from a presentation from a UBC professor who predicted immigration levels and possibilities, which would be interesting to look at. You don't have to memorize the numbers or anything. I received this presentation from, I participated in the event a while ago, and this was when I was working at the association that I worked with, and that's why I had the presentation. But I have permission, keep the professor had given permission to use his slides. And his name is Dan Heber. He's a professor in geography at UBC, and he has many affiliations that put him in the right place to make these projections and claims. He was a part of the advisory council for immigration refugees in Canada for a long time, and he's also a very active researcher and has a lot of updated data. And this event actually was one where he was protecting this to service providers and government officials, and he shares this information a lot, which is really nice. Anyways, so here he's sort of talking about asylum claims that, and he's sort of doing a graph in terms of how they have changed since the pandemic happened. And you can see that in terms of asylum claimants who are people who are seeking basically refuge from Canada by coming at the port of entry. It's either by air or border, or they're living inland as well. And their number is pretty small, but you can see that, as I mentioned earlier, Canada doesn't accept a lot of this type of claimants, and you can see that how much they decreased as a result of COVID. And the next slide is the PR admissions by major category in BC in specific, and you can see that again, like as I mentioned, like the blue line is the economic class, which has been highest. It took a hit in 2019, and then again in April 2020, but then it's on the rise again. So these shifts that happened were due to different major changes, including COVID-19. But you can see the difference between this blue line and the family class, and the refugee class is so drastic. This is pretty. It also decreased in terms of in comparison to permanent residents, but also it's pretty consistent in the drastic difference that it has from the economic class. And this is following his projections in terms of Canada's population. So he's knowing that Canada's population stopped growing in 2020 because of the reduced immigration that happened because of COVID, and he also is projecting that Canada is not always growing because COVID happened, and we're seeing this shortfall, and he sort of is projecting that the pace of baby boom retirement is going to be continuing, and the concern remains. Unless in a few years, all the plans that the government has for immigration levels go as planned, and one of the challenges would be how many of those immigrants will actually stay longer in active in the labor market as well.